back. How you doing, bud? How's your week been?
My weekend is good. The weekend is coming. We are in a snow cycle. It snowed about 10 inches last night and it's supposed to snow for the next 10 days. We're talking about several feet of accumulation, which is good because it's looking pretty paltry out here in this high country. So things are getting better.
Good for the skiing. Yes. Well, we've got a lot to talk about. I don't know that we're going to get through all this because I don't know. I really like our itinerary today and some of the topics. It'll be interesting to see where we go on this. I mean, the first thing that I think we should just kind of get going here because, well, let's just talk about it. The 3D printed talus. We've been talking about in these neuroscience pieces before the meat of the podcast. We've been talking about technology and 3D printers a lot and where, wearable technology and 3D printing are going to come around here. And this one's talking about a 3D printed talus. Now, the talus, if you don't know, which you should if you're one of, on the Gate Guys brethren here, is one of the largest bones in the foot. It's the second largest. The calcaneus is the biggest. This is the second largest of the tarsal bones. And this one is interesting because nothing muscularly attaches to it. This guy is kind of directed indirectly by everything that's above it and below it and to the sides of it and all the tendons that come across it. And so it's really unique in that aspect, but it's quite frequently injured. And I've got two cases right now of a talar compression injuries of the front part of the talus there near the neck, where people have gone and slammed their foot into terminal dorsiflexion and have got a osteochondral defect, if you will, where the cartilage and the bone have been disrupted from the compression and they have a lot of pain on dorsiflexion. And it's interesting because the body is now blocking them out of dorsiflexion by increasing tone in the Achilles and the calf complex. They've altered their gait. Obviously, if you've been with us here long enough, you'll know that they've altered their hip extension. The glute becomes inhibited. They may go into knee extension or blocking out of knee flexion strategies. And so this is coming around, and I've often wondered when are they going to be able to do this talus transplants. And so they're actually printing a 3D talus. What they're using is a CT scan, CAT scan, if you will, of the patient's unaffected side of the talus, and then they basically flip the image around through reconstruction software, and then they actually print out the talus and insert it surgically. And it's interesting because the only solution for a lot of these people was to either deal with the pain or go into a fusion where they fused the talus and the tibia and the subtalar interval, so that the patient now loses ankle dorsiflexion. Now, if you think about it, this is a problem biomechanically too, because now they don't have dorsiflexion. But think a little further, this is even more difficult because as a surgeon, what angle do you fuse them at? If you fuse them too far into dorsiflexion, then they'll never get into normal heel rise and toe off normally and push off with the calf. And if you fuse them too much into plantar flexion, they'll lose ankle dorsiflexion, which we know is going to screw up a lot of the gait cycle too. So, God, I'm just thinking we could go into a whole podcast just off of this. But what did you think of the study, and what are your thoughts at this point?
Talar fractures represent a very small percentage of total fractures, about 1% of what we see in, fractures total, and about 3 to 5% of what we see in the feet. And the interesting thing, like what you're talking about, and I'm assuming you're talking about the talar dome, where you're getting some compression there. An interesting study by a guy named Dale was looking at these and found that 30% of the time you can't see it radiographically, which is really common. And on that, I would say that I've seen a fair number of those, but I've also seen some fractures of the medial process of the talus, and kind of where it sits on top of the sus. And I would encourage anybody who's listening out there, when you're sending somebody out for films, a lot of times, and that's why it's handy, we have radiology right in the office, to be able to have it right there, because you can put the film up And we've had to tilt. So kind of like when you're doing an oblique, an oblique's generally at about 40 to 45 degrees angles. We've actually had to tilt that and tweak that to different angles to be able to actually see the fractures, and the point tenderness, positive tuning fork sign, those sorts of things will generally show up, on your exam, but you're not seeing anything radiographically. So remember, about a third of these you're not going to be able to see radiographically, especially if it's acute. And you're going to have to do other imaging. But the fascinating thing here is, for me, would be to watch them replace this, because it is one of the few bones that has nothing that attaches to it. So it's like, do they have these super duper forceps that they go in there and spread the joint apart and they pop out one talus and pop in the new one? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Just as far as how that whole thing works. But that was the most fascinating thing, the fact that we have 3D printing of pretty much everything. I mean, we talked a while ago about the ear that somebody had 3D printed as far as the external, the auricle and the pinna and everything. So this really isn't that surprising. It's pretty cool that they were able to actually manufacture it. And this particular gentleman begins with an M that was in the article. Manzanian, I think it was this guy that pioneered the procedure. They do this a lot. So I think it's really cool. And I'd have to say, and you probably would agree with me, I've seen a number of ankle surgeries in my office and in my days, and I haven't seen many successful ones that have affected the talus that have not totally, destroyed somebody's ankle rocker or something like that. So it'd be interesting to see, looking at the longitudinal studies, how these folks do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the X-ray portion is really important, and you brought up some other thoughts there. If you've got let's say you've got a ping pong ball and you've put a little divot in there with your thumb. The only way to actually see that divot on an X-ray is to get it on a cutting on the right angle, where you can either get a confluence of densities, where you get overlapping densities, or you're just going to have to get it perfectly, on a tangent where you can kind of get the eye line right through the divot on the horizon, if you will. And, I'm reminded of a case that just came in 2 weeks ago of a young gal who had X-rays, and she had an ankle sprain, and she had no swelling down around the actual medial malleolus. All of her swelling was down into the lateral foot. And I asked her if she could raise her toes, and she said, "I can't, it hurts too much." And I gently put my thumb into her extensor digitorum brevis, and she jumped off the roof. And the only reason why I knew that this was a partial tear of the extensor digitorum brevis that masks itself and looks like an ankle sprain is because I've seen this beast before many a times, and it's misdiagnosed. They take X-rays because the amount of pain the person's in is extraordinary. And it's extraordinary because they can't walk properly, and the pain is being driven because they can't raise the toes. But when you walk, you generally have to engage your extensors. So every time she took a step, she engaged her extensors, and it pulled at the tear and gave her excruciating pain. So these things look like a foot fracture. So I didn't fault them for taking an X-ray. I think it was very warranted. But in my residency, we had the luxury that you do of having X-ray in-house. So we learned that taking X-rays on a tangent would allow us to, on an angle, would allow us to, similar to the ping pong ball, actually see the actual micro avulsions of the bone with the extensor digitorum brevis tears, and certainly see the swelling on profile. So X-rays are really kind of important, and you got to know how to use them. And a lot of the times they have these standard views at the radiology departments and emergency rooms, and their job, remember, is just to rule out the fracture. But if you manipulate the actual technology, you can get better detailed answers. So you're a lucky man to have it in office there. And but these talar things are really a bugger. And I was not talking about talar dome fractures, and that's where you're going to get articular cartilage with the subchondral bone getting depressed, kind of the ping pong ball divot. And so these ones were from the anterior lip of the tibia slamming down distal into the more proximal or forward part, anterior part of the talar neck. And so it was a significant hyperdorsiflexion event, if you will, similar to footballer's ankle, if you know what that is. Footballer meaning soccer. But anyways, it's nice to see that they've got these options now, maybe in the future here, of taking these ankles that eventually go into severe vascular necrosis. The patient just can't walk. It's severe pain. It takes time for these things to basically start to crumble and collapse, and the patient eventually just can't walk. So rather than having the fusion done, these patients now have a nice option of getting a total talar replacement. And remember, because there's really not a lot attaching to this thing, it's just a matter of can opening this thing enough that you can pull the old one out and put the new one in. And certainly that's simplified, but it's not quite as cumbersome as taking something that's got a bunch of ligaments attached to it and muscular insertions and whatnot. So it'd be really interesting to see how much more this thing gets brought out into the functional athletes and as years go by. But I think this one's going to become commonplace as a knee replacement, if I'm not mistaken.
The other cool thing about this particular procedure or article is what they do is, this was mostly used for people with OA unilaterally, osteoarthritis. So what they do is they actually image the good side, and then they take that image and invert it, and that's how they create the opposite side. So that was kind of cool as well, provided, so this works really great provided your other talus is in good shape.
Yeah. So, you want to take the floor on this next one? It's kind of up your alley.
So
or I can introduce it.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm just...
Okay, while you pull it up. Yeah, this next one's basically on stopping exercise decreases brain blood flow. And I figured this was right up your alley because it's more neuro-based. But researchers have been looking at these elderly patients, 50 to 80-year-olds, and looking and seeing what happens as exercise stops, what happens to brain perfusion. And certainly, I think a lot of this literature is being spurred off of dementia and Alzheimer's and senility and all of that. But we know that when we stop working out, the cardiovascular endurance really starts to tank after a brief period of time, a couple weeks for sure, and muscular hypertrophy and strength starts to diminish. The magic number seems to be 21 days when it's all you've lost most of your stuff, or either that or it's where it's starting to tip off the edge. I'm not sure, but this new research out of the University of Maryland School of Public Health looked at the 10-day mark. And so they looked at these physically fit older adults between 50 and 80 before and after a 10-day period in which they stopped all exercise. And the MRI imaging, it was interesting. What'd you think of this? Because this is all about the hippocampus and the role in learning and memory and the limbic system and short-term to long-term memory and whatnot. So what'd you think of this one?
First of all, everybody should probably know, if you haven't looked at the article yet, it's out of Neuroscience News, that the individuals they picked are like uber master athletes. These people are in incredible amounts of shape and worked out for what basically would be the equivalent, they were runners, of running 10K a day, 7 days a week for that age class, which would put them automatically above increased perfusion as far as blood flow, not only to muscles as well as brain. We know that exercise does things like increases nitric oxide, which is a vasodilator, and that you will grow blood vessels because of angiogenesis factors, sort of like these cofactors that are made in response to metabolic demand. So if we have a brain that needs more oxygen, it's going to put more capillaries there. If we have a muscle that needs more oxygen, it's going to put more capillaries in that individual muscle. And that's under control somewhat of nitric oxide, as well as something else called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which involves neurite growth, or the growth of little axons of nerves. So when we're exercising and we're forming new synapses and connections, we're going to have a blood flow that's going to supply that. So it's really not surprising that if we stop exercising, that you're going to have some attrition of that blood flow. You don't use it, you lose it. And really, we've known this for a long time, and we've talked all about exercise and lack of exercise and cognitive decline and things like that in other podcasts. So nothing earth-shaking here, but what was really earth-shaking was, one, the amount of decrease of blood flow, and particularly in the hippocampus and the parahippocampal areas, which is, if you think about the brain, right, if you saw One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, right, they did a frontal lobotomy, where they basically go up and they cut the corpus callosum. So right above the corpus callosum, that area that connects one side of the brain to the other, is the cingulate gyrus, and the hippocampus is in that area. So it's right above that area. But just the amount that it changed, and it changed so drastically and quickly, it goes to show you that, one, a little exercise can go a long way, and two, it's okay to take some time off, but you really do need to continue to move if you want to keep your marbles. And we said that on more than one occasion here.
Yeah, I mean, the decrease was so significant in these areas of what they call the default mode network of the brain that they showed that they were deteriorating almost as quickly as in Alzheimer's patients' progression. So it's quite significant, as you said, and something to think about. And basically, keep moving and get your folks, and if not them and it's you, just get moving. It's a significant improvement in a short period of time, and it's a significant decrease in a short period of time. So just keep moving is the key here, especially in your elderly clients, getting them to move. And we've got some other topics that are going to, parlay into this here shortly. But movement is medicine, and as soon as we stop moving and exercising, the body and the brain, as we're finding out right here, start to decline rather significantly. So.
But if you go to the Gait Guys website, you can download the new exercise pill that we've been working on, which actually reverses all of these things. We talked about it a few podcasts ago. So just go to the gateguys.com and look for the little button for the download of the exercise pill. And you can reverse these things as well.
Yes, it's $1,000 per pill, by the way. And, we don't take Bitcoin, so cash only.
Exercise is medicine, and boy, you just don't ever really want to stop moving. I don't think that's what was intended. And with movement comes learning. When we move, we activate our cerebellums, and our cerebellums are tremendously involved with learning motor tasking and things like that. So it's just super important. So as you're listening to this podcast, hopefully you're doing something like maybe riding a bike or running on a treadmill or walking or doing something like that. So.
There you go. So this one kind of rang true, and you'll see this all come together here as the podcast moves on. I had a very talented young marathoner, triathlete, biathlete, biker. Young lady came in, and I believe she's in her late 20s maybe, and she's had 2 pelvic stress fractures, two femoral neck stress fractures, greater trochanteric fracture, a medial epicondyle fracture at the knee, multiple stress fractures in the feet, and so no surprise, guys. Yeah, she has some hormonally induced osteoporotic and osteopenic factors here. And when you take the amount of movement that this young lady does and the amount of running and pounding, it's no surprise that she's going to be a risk factor for these types of fractures. And this next article talks about babies who walk earlier may have stronger bones in their early teens. And so my first question for you is, do you have dialogues with some of the new parents, first-time parents, and about when to allow their kids to become bipedal and keeping them quadruped as long as possible until they develop some of the, functional movement and neurodevelopmental patterns? Do you give them a time frame or a ballpark time frame?
There's lots of sources out there. I think that most children are supposed to walk somewhere between 9 and 14 months. We discourage people to, how you pick the kid up and you hold them by the hand and you make them kind of try to walk, across possibly before they're totally able. We try to discourage that for a lot of the reasons, because you really want to develop that cross-crawl pattern and the ability to rotate and turn properly and things like that. But also, you can dramatically affect the rotation or derotation of the talar neck, the tibia, as well as the femoral head. And we've talked about torsions here many, many, many times. And affecting that at a younger age or before you go through certain developmental windows certainly would have consequences. So the whole article, babies who walk earlier may have stronger bones. That makes sense. It's Wolff's Law. We know that bones deposited in areas of stress and removed in areas of strain. So no real big surprises there. You're going to lay down more Haversian systems, more hydroxyapatite crystallization and things like that. So you will have a stronger cross-sectional bone, but at what cost? So it would be interesting to look at cognitive function and motor function in these individuals. Coordination, you could do something as simple as just measure proprioception in these kids who walk earlier and find out, how has it affected that as far as having the whole stronger bone thing. So to answer your question in a very long-winded and roundabout way, yes, we have those discussions. We encourage people to keep their kids in minimal type shoes or barefoot. We really like the Robies, which are sort of like a leather moccasin for kiddos while they're developing and things like that. And we really try to encourage turning as well as crawling over walking. They will be bipedal soon enough. And if you're a soon-to-be parent listening to this, once they're walking, it's a lot harder to keep track of them than it is when they're quadrupedal or not walking. So keeping them there has certain advantages from a parenting standpoint as well.
Yeah, buy yourself a few more months of peace before the racing begins. This article, the British scientists reported that toddlers who can walk, run, and jump by the time they're 18 months old may have stronger bones as teenagers, and that may translate into a reduced risk of osteoporosis and fractures, even 16 years later. So nothing surprising here. Loading the system, loading the bones, loading them axially and through some torsional loading, which occurs with normal pronation, supination, and whatnot, is going to give you a stronger bone and help the system to develop. And so the translation to that was basically that, if there are some developmental delays in your child, there may be some osteoporotic, osteopenic developmental problems down the road that may add some increased risk to them if they are in sports, or certainly as they move into the elderly years where the rate of osteoclastic tear down of bone outpaces the osteoblastic buildup phase of bone. So the study also found that toddlers who walked early had larger muscles and may be more likely to engage in physical activity when they are older. Nothing earth-shattering here, but at least it allowed us to talk about something that was out in the news a little bit here. So
it may not be a good thing. That's what, it has advantages, but whenever you have one side of a coin, you always have the other side of the coin. So you really don't want to skip developmental windows. It's like sticking a kid in shoes right away. They lose, some degree of proprioception as they're going through development. And we know that proprioception involves the cerebellum, and we know that the cerebellum involves learning. And we really don't want to impede any of that in our kiddos. So if your child is naturally walking earlier, that might be a good thing. But if they're not naturally walking earlier, I don't know if we really necessarily want to push that or push them into it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there may be other issues, as you've alluded to, that may be higher developmental lagging issues and move you into the spectrum disorders of autism and all these other things. So that's where you start leaning on your experts. So we've talked about Australopithecus before. That's a mouthful. Lucy is the 3.2 million year old skeleton that they found in Ethiopia over 40 years ago, and she is the oldest and most complete human relative that we've ever found. Why did I jump into this one? Well, we were just talking about kids and crawling. If you've been on our website, we've written numerous articles on climbing, rock climbing, and looking at motor neuron pools and cross-crawl patterns and development of higher functional areas in the brain in climbers, and that when we start to engage the upper limbs, we start to require and recruit more of the upper motor neuron pools that run the muscle activity and whatnot and coordination of the upper limbs. And as humans that have gone bipedal, we tend to run a more dominant lower motor neuron pool and those types of ambulatory gait patterns. And by looking at Lucy here, one of the biggest debates that we've had is whether or not Lucy, our supposed 3.2 million ancestor was more walking the prairies, or was she up in the trees? And this most recent piece was actually quite interesting. This one was out of PopSci. We'll have it in the show notes as always with all of our stuff. But, these were little people, and they described them as being no larger than modern kindergartners. So they're tiny little folks. But when they started looking at her a little bit more, they realized that maybe she was, because of her development, as we've been talking about, was maybe more up into the trees than we thought. And they felt almost definitively from the study of Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine that she was definitely a tree living person, so if you will. And if you start looking at her bones, as this study suggests, her body shows morphological features somewhere between that of a modern chimp and a modern human being. Her lower body seems well suited for walking, but her trunk and limbs are peppered with primitive adaptations for climbing. And there's been, like I said, there's been a lot of these arguments on this, but many of these features point out that that many researchers believe could be acquired naturally by climbing. And so I'll read this next part, and then I'm going to let Ivo kind of jump in here. We know these parameters are developmentally plastic, one of the researchers says. They change based on how you use your limb. When humans are born, he says, the ratio of strength between their upper limb and their lower limb bones are quite similar to the ratio seen in monkeys. It's only once you start walking that you develop a thigh bone relatively stronger than your upper arm bone. And people who put particularly mechanical stress on a bone make it stronger. And then they go ahead and say that tennis players have been found to develop stronger bones on their more dominant side, as we would expect. So these latest examinations suggest that she spent a good portion of her time hanging out on branches because of the upper limb and torso development and the bone density and whatnot. So what'd you think of this guy? Because it certainly goes back to the articles we've written on climbing, and it certainly parlays nicely into crawling, which we were just talking about. What are your initial thoughts on this, or did you have some things you wanted to throw in the mix here?
I really don't have a whole lot of input, of a kind of it is what it is. Her arm bones were thicker. Perhaps she liked to climb. Okay. But, I really didn't have a whole lot more there.
Yeah, I mean, there's not a lot here. We've talked about the evolutionary things way back in podcasts, maybe 8, 9, 10 or something like that, back in our archives here, looking at the Scars of Evolution book and some of the thoughts and theories in there. This was just nice to return to that a little bit, because the research is now saying some of our ancestors were up in the trees, perhaps staying away from predators, but also foraging for food as well. So maybe we should all get back to climbing a little bit more, build some of that upper body strength. Certainly that's the trend we see towards CrossFit now. There's certainly a lot more of that going on, and you can see it in the builds of these folks. They've got gorgeous bodies, that's for sure.
We won't get into the whole CrossFit thing, not today.
No, we've done that many a time, and both good and bad, obviously, but as most things in this life, there's good and bad to all. So you want to jump down to that Alex Hutchinson one, the one on movement patterns, because that was fascinating to me, and I'd love to hear what you have to say about all that stuff with the from the Journal of Current Biology one, the one that talks about learning.
The article was actually out of Globe and Mail, and basically what they were comparing was, is it better to do something trial and error, or is it better to watch and learn? And which system was better? And what they did is they put these people on a split treadmill, and then what they did is, just to mess with them a little bit, is they changed the speed of one of the treadmills, and then they watched what would happen to their gait. And what they found is that people, within a relatively short time, a few minutes, were able to adapt and develop a smooth gait again with this. So it took them a while to adapt, but then they were able to adapt. Then with the other group, what they did is the same thing, but rather than having them stumble along, they offered them visual feedback of what was going on in the situation. And they were able to almost immediately correct what was going on. But once they removed the visual feedback, the problem or the asymmetrical gait came back rather quickly. So the interesting thing was, and there's really not an answer to this, which is better. It seems like trial and error gives us longer term changes, and watching and learning gives us faster changes. So why not do both? That kind of is what makes sense. And that's sort of the approach that we take in rehab in the office. But anyway, that's the gist of it. It was in Journal of Current Biology as far as the actual study. If you wanted to go back and read it, Amy Bastian at Kennedy Krieger Institute and Johns Hopkins was the one that had done this.
The part of the article that I found fascinating, it certainly kind of struck a note with me, was that they discussed this. Here, I'll read it. If I have someone who had a stroke on one side of the brain and they may not be able to consciously fix their gait, the researcher suggests that putting them on a split treadmill triggers a process of physical learning through trial and error that doesn't require their conscious input. So, of course, that immediately went into my mind of, well, if I've got somebody with, a knee replacement or a hip replacement, or someone who's got a chronically sprained ankle or a painful joint, just kind of all these thoughts flooded into my head of how to maybe use a treadmill, or certainly we don't have a split treadmill in our office, but it certainly it brought some thoughts of the learning process and rehab process to mind. I don't know how you would do that without having a split treadmill, but bringing the patient's awareness in multiple ways is something that you and I have always talked about. We've got mirrors in the office. We have them walk towards the mirror. We have them listen to the foot contact. Are they striking the heel hard, or is the foot slap? Is there a forefoot slap? Is it on one side? Is it both sides? What's the cadence like? I know you like to use metronomes. And just bringing their awareness to all kinds of new levels. I have patients who have a narrow-based gait. I have them walk with a balance beam on either side of a balance beam, just to cue that separation a little bit. Have them look in the mirror. Have them feel what it feels like. Have them close their eyes. So there's lots of these different inputs that you can use in order to restore someone's gait, but a lot of times you have to bring the awareness to them. First of all, they need to feel the heaviness of plunking down on a side that might have some anterior shin weakness, or maybe 10 miles into the run they feel that forefoot slap on that side because they've lost some endurance on that anterior compartment of their tib anterior toe extensors on that foot, which might correlate to their stress fracture incidence on that foot. Lots of little things, but awareness is really there. And as this article suggested, sometimes adding the visual with the trial and error is really where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. So they also went into cadence too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It was an interesting article, and looking at it, there really is no conclusions as far as which is best. But it was interesting to look at that. I really hadn't thought of it that way before. We've just sort of, I guess, always kind of combined both, so we could get, the most bang for our buck when people are in the office. So,
yeah. Last podcast we talked about, was cadence the last podcast? Was that the one we were? It's probably the one we haven't launched just yet, or by the time you guys hear this one, it will have launched. But they mentioned something in here, and I did highlight it, and I thought maybe it was worth talking about just to fulfill that last podcast. In some cases, learning a new pattern requires overriding the decisions your brain has made about what's optimal. For example, some running coaches suggest increasing cadence, which is the number of steps you take a minute. We all know that. People naturally chose a cadence that minimizes their energy cost, but that cadence may cause higher stress on their tibia. And so that they go on to say that it's difficult to increase your cadence by trial and error, since your brain favors your energy minimizing natural cadence. And if you use real-time feedback, for example, by running with a metronome, ticking at your desired cadence, these authors' results suggest that you'll quickly revert back to the old cadence as soon as you remove the headphones. And so they then made this suggestion of one option is to just rely on rote repetition. You run with the metronome for long enough that the new pattern eventually becomes your new automatic rote pattern. So I thought that was interesting, not shocking, but something to think about if you don't run with a metronome. And on that note, they finished up with a fascinating thought that on a more intriguing option is to manipulate the feedback your brain receives from your body. Perhaps you could use like a smartphone app that amplifies the sound of your feet hitting the ground, but offsets it by a fraction of a second. And as your brain attempts to reconcile its expectations with the manipulated feedback, you'll gradually but unconsciously alter your cadence. The resulting changes may be more lasting. So just interesting stuff to think about here. This is the stuff that I like to bounce around and think about and tinker with in the office, because if you're not playing with the new literature and the new science, you might not actually be seeing the results optimized as best as possible. So we wrote an article this week on the glutes as internal hip rotators, and it followed your great video on the glutes. What'd you think of, it was a huge week. I mean, our listeners shared this thing, up the river, and it was two of it was probably our biggest week ever in terms of hits and shares and engagement of stuff on social media. Obviously, you guys are big into the glutes, and I was looking at it from an acupuncture standpoint and activation, mostly through the extensor type thing, and then I decided, I'd look at it through the internal rotation aspect. Both are valid. We tend to always think of the glutes as this hip stabilizer and propulsive type muscle, but I tried to take a slight tangent on that and look at an old piece of literature from 1999, which we hope to have in the show notes. If not, just go over to our blog and look at that article called The Glutes Are in Fact Great Internal Hip Rotators. And, it brought to mind of how much the glutes can work when they're in flexion as an internal rotator, which certainly brought up the thoughts of crawling, which goes back to Lucy and the baby and everything else that we've talked about today. Give us some glute thoughts here, Mr. Ivo.
Well, I have to say that I've thought about some of this stuff before, but not quite as much as you had. And I wasn't familiar with the Delt paper until I actually had read it earlier this week. Mechanically, it makes total sense. Sauerman was my first exposure to a lot of glute function, Shirley Sauerman, and she was talking about different muscles having different functions in flexion and extension, and we talk about that oftentimes. It makes total sense that some fibers of the G max, definitely fibers of the G med, particularly anterior fibers, and the G min fibers are going to act as internal rotators as we start to move them forward of the hip. Surprising to me was some of the other musculature that was. So the only obligate external rotators that there were the iliopsoas, the quadratus femoris, and the obturator externus. Everything else is perceived to be somewhat of an internal rotator, but the way, when I read the article, and we can talk about the article in a little bit here, is more that it's less of an external rotator rather than an internal rotator. In other words, the forces required were much less. There were some methodological, I don't want to say flaws, but areas of question in my mind when they ran the study. One, it was a cadaver study. Two, they removed all the muscles and they approximated their functions with strings, and I'm assuming attached to those strings some sort of a force meter so they could measure moments in different areas. But it was quite enlightening looking at that, and it really does bring into play how important the glutes are in things like crawling, and I think you really brought that to light when you were talking in your article this week, which, like I said, I was unfamiliar with the Delt paper until earlier this week when I read through it. But it was, it was good, and we always train the glutes that way with crawling and stuff. I mean, we use a ton of cross-crawl movements with the rehab process. So it's not like really that we were missing anything. It's more like, I hadn't thought of it that way, as far as how it's functioning. There are questions in my mind. I would love to see this particular study done with people with EMG needles in them, in the individual muscle while they're going through some of these motions, particularly hip flexion, internal, external rotation, as well as crawling, to actually test this. And to my knowledge, there hasn't been a study done like that yet, at least that I've seen. And if there is, and you guys have read it out there, please send it to us so we can look at it. But it would be interesting to actually look at the activation patterns and things like that. And the other interesting thing is that this paper came out quite a while ago, and nobody's really talked about it a lot since then, or kind of reproduced the information.
Yeah, that's the shocking thing, that no one has gone out there and said we need to take this to the next level. And like you said, EMG needles. Let's use the modern technology here instead of strings. We tend to think of these normal models, and so in the article we put up a traditional, I think it was a Netter origin insertion of, the leg at 0 degrees, as in a standing position. And we tend to always think of anatomy that way. And, I was trying to encourage in the article that you need to think of things in different positions. And it requires a lot of 3D mental gymnastics in order to really get a grip on these things. Because you have to remember, a lot of times you're testing patients in variable ranges of motion. And you need to understand that our traditional thinking of how a muscle works and how it stabilizes the joint and how it creates torque around a joint in motion, it changes as that angle changes. And this was a great example of, we tend to think of the glutes as these stabilizers and hip extensors, but as you move into 90 degrees hip flexion, the glute, especially the iliac division, becomes a powerful internal rotator. And when you couple that, with some other muscles, we've got some serious stabilization and drivers of rotation, internal rotation. And so we tend to think of the glutes as big external rotators. So this was kind of a spin on your knowledge base by changing the joint just 90 degrees. Something that we've been thinking of as an external rotator becomes an internal rotator. If you're listening to this and you don't have the article or our blog post in front of you, you're going to have to go over to the blog at thegateguys.com. The date that we did it was December the 8th, 2016. Excuse me. Where was that coming from? Then you can see the picture of the hip inflection, and we've put some arrows in there so you can actually kind of put the mechanics together a little bit. But, I've been doing crawling in my office for many years now, tall kneeling. I've been calling it upright kneeling, but I understand that some of the FMS and trainers call it tall kneeling, and I actually like that. So I've started using tall kneeling because it tends to give the patient the idea of tall posture as well while they're in this position, and certainly helps them a little bit more aware of what I'm looking for. But the tall kneeling tends to be, the hip is still in that vertical upright position. So I have a lot of my patients move from deep-seated flexion into hip extension. I have them do what I call diagonal sitting and moving up into lunge positions from there. It's kind of a jiu-jitsu type posturing, but it causes a lot of rotation and flexion in the hip and loading during those movements. And of course, if you're into the DNS work from Collage's work out of Prague, Czechoslovakia, you'll know that the DNS has a lot of crawling work and neurodevelopmental turning patterns. And that's where you have to understand that if you can't stabilize that hip, both in external rotation, neutral, and in rotation, as well in the crawling patterns, you've got some serious problems because you can't develop the crawling locomotor pattern off of that, which is a precursor to upright cruising and bipedalism. So you need to understand how this child moves from supine into crawling and into cruising and ambulating. And you need to understand that one of the key functions is learning how to stabilize that hip. One of the ways I like to explain it to my patients, then they ask, why am I doing this on my knees? I walk on my feet. And I said, look, you have got so many challenges to your system right now. I am in theory cutting your legs off at the knee and forcing you to teach yourself hip stability at the knee level, so that you don't have to worry about balance over, a pronated foot or a supinated foot or a loss of ankle dorsiflexion. We're just working on the single joint above it, which is the hip right now. And that's why I love the kneeling stuff. And I do all kinds of variations like you do with diagonal patterns and walking forward on the knees and backwards and in narrow stances and wide stance and with weight shifts in the arms to activate the glute. It's very helpful. And if you're having troubles getting your patients into better glute stability, cut them off at the knees in theory and put them on their knees and start working in the crawling and tall kneeling and variations from seated to tall kneeling, and move through those progressions, and you'll find some nice progressions for your client. And I think that's, go back and look at the Delp article, variations of rotational moment arms with hip flexion. It is old, like we said, it's from 1999, but there's some gems in there. And Greg Lehman is the fellow that really kind of brought this to the surface in his article just a little while ago. And one of our readers, Ben, brought it to our attention and was asking some questions, and he and I were going back and forth on some very high-level biomechanical discussions, which was very fun and interesting. An old student of mine. So it was good to reconnect with Ben and do some mental jousting. So we'll leave the rest of that to you. Go and read the article, and you can do your own dive down the rabbit hole of glutes and internal rotation. Got anything else there, bud?
No, but, something I'll be reading about this week will be trying to find anything I can on EMG studies looking at people crawling and seeing what glute function is like. Because the interesting thing is here, if we think just about the G-max or any of the gluteuses, medius, minimus, its activity during then, we should really not see a change in the electrical activation. In other words, the muscles contracting concentrically, what's changing is the position of the femur or the hip joint. So you really shouldn't see a major change unless you're looking at torque, internal, external on the femur. And I seriously doubt any studies have actually looked at that. But the muscular activation over the portion of that should be, theoretically the same. Now, if you're doing anterior aspect of gluteus, medius, and minimus, you'll see much more activity during internal rotation, and you'll see a fall off as you start to move the hip into extension and get into more external rotation because of the obligate movement. So when we're looking at the studies, we have to be real careful to see, where do they do needle placement? And sometimes, I read a lot of needling studies, obviously. You have to look at where did they place the needle within the muscle. In other words, with the gluteus medius, if you're in the anterior fibers, it's an internal rotator. If you're in the middle fibers, it's an abductor. And if you're in the posterior fibers, it's an external rotator. So depending upon what I'm checking, if the needle's in the anterior portion of the gluteus medius and I'm checking external rotation, I'm not going to see a whole lot of activity. So it's the whole looking at the study, getting the study, not just looking at the abstract, reading through, looking at the pictures, picking through the references, making sure that, specifically, and sometimes you really have to dig deep to find the answers to some of these things. And I'm sure you go through the same things as far as that. I've even gone as far sometimes as to contact authors. If something was specific, wasn't covered in an article, I'll send them an email. It's like, hey, I was reading this and, I saw this here. Can you explain this to me? And most people are more than happy, ourselves included. It's like, wow, you read my paper. Cool. What can I tell you about it? As far as what would you like to know?
Things.
Exactly. So I can certainly relate to that. But anyway, certainly some compelling information. And I have to say, kudos to you. Definitely some new information to me on some of those muscles. I went back and looked at that chart that's in the Delp paper, which was actually quite instructive. Going through looking at the forces and really couldn't believe, wow, the force really did change. So to me, that was, especially for muscles like the piriformis, becoming an internal rotator just totally blew my mind. Some of the muscles you can see how they would change. It's like, oh yeah, well that makes sense from a physics standpoint. But some of the others just didn't. So anyway, thank you.
Yeah, sure. It's and we've agreed in our discussion prior to the podcast here that it's a little difficult to conceptualize that piriformis, even with the knowledge base that we have now, as an internal rotator. I think that if it is, it's probably a very, very, very weak one because of the moment arm. Once you see the study and you see the diagram that I used, I think it would be very weak. I think the iliac glute max would be far more powerful. But you need to know your functional anatomy. One of the ones that we always get from folks is, how in the world is the vastus lateralis an internal rotator? Well, you've been thinking about it as an open chain rotator, so you probably think it's an external rotator. But when you change the the fixation point to the foot and you move over it, it changes the actual dynamics of the vastus lateralis. So if that's a bit of a brain puzzle for you, just go over to our blog and see if you can type in vastus lateralis or internal rotation. Eventually you'll come across some article that we've written that will explain how it becomes an powerful internal rotator. But interesting stuff, and it's nice to do these mental gymnastics. And if you don't know your hip biomechanics, you can't just start throwing clients into crawling patterns without knowing that there's some risk of impingement and cam type deformities of the femur. You have to understand all of those things, because if your client has some tightness or the instability and you're forcing them into these patterns, especially dynamically or loaded, you could be creating some impingement. There's a ton of people coming in and a ton of people out there that have these labral tears, and a lot of them are driven just by faulty biomechanics. Yes, some of them are driven by injury, but a lot of them are just because of this imbalance across the joint. So just be careful who you start throwing things at. If you don't understand the shear and roll and glide and eccentric and movements across a ball and socket joint, you're going to have some problems. So the motions of accessory roll and glide are something that you really need to understand, especially if you're going to move someone into these terminal hip flexion movements where they could be impinging in the anterior hip joint. So you got to understand then pelvic mechanics, anterior pelvic tilt effects on that flexed hip, and posterior pelvic tilt and neutral mechanics, and that when you are crawling and you lift one leg off the ground, now all of a sudden you have to pull in the glute medius as well in order to keep the pelvis stabilized. And the abdominals are used differently in this position because they're in a quadruped position, but they're in hip flexion. And as I've alluded to, all the hip flexors. So it gets really complicated when you move away from bipedal gait that I've always kind of talked about here. So crawling and climbing, they're very different. Go on our website, type in crawling and climbing into the search box and start reading, and hopefully you'll get a little bit more in tune with some of this stuff. And then you can go ahead and pick up the DELP article, which we've linked in our December the 8th blog post. You can and it's a full PDF article. So there you go. I think we should stop there. I wonder if our listeners are either vomiting now, tired of drinking from the fire hose, or have fallen off to sleep. But hopefully it's just sitting there on the edge of their seats. But I'm sure we've lost a couple people.
They've already gone to look for the DELP article. That's me.
Yeah, maybe.
I'm already like looking the reference up before the guys finished the lecture. I'm like, wait a minute. You're like rocking my world here. I don't like it when people move my cheese. So it's no, I think that's good, and that will give certainly people something to chew on in the meantime. And, think about these things. And when you have questions, send them in. We like questions. Questions that are thought-provoking are obviously much more appealing to us as far as that. And people are always bringing articles to our attention. Sean and I both read a lot, but there's no way we can keep up with everything that's out there. And it's always appreciated when people bring stuff to our attention that's something that maybe we hadn't looked at, in quite a while. So neat stuff.
And on that note, folks, we can't get to all your questions and all your emails. It's just impossible. It's like a fire hydrant every morning when we open up the emails and the Facebook questions. But on that note, here's a nice one. I decided just to respond to this guy just very, very briefly, because we don't like to shun everybody off, and sometimes if it's a quick response, we'll give it to him. But this was from a reader in Ohio. Dave wrote, recently found your podcast through Runners Connect, and I'm going through many of the episodes. They are great. I was wondering for any of the podcasts or blogs you have on tight calf muscles and couldn't find anything. I cannot find any search option available. Was wondering if you could direct me to anything that you might recommend I look at. So I just responded, Dave, go to our website. There's a search box. Type in ankle rocker, ankle dorsiflexion, tight calf. Good luck. Dave writes back, guys, I've been doing the ankle rocker restoration exercises that you have on YouTube, and I'm amazed how quickly it has helped my tight calves and Achilles. I've been struggling in my running with super tight calves for a long time, and everyone else recommends extensive stretching, which has only made them worse. Yours is the first recommendation that has worked. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the podcast. If I'm ever in the Chicagoland area, I'll look one of you guys up. So, we don't like people to send in these questions, long histories. We just got one from a fellow over in, it was in Finland. And he's writing a PhD and he's looking for some advice from us, and he's, it's just really cool. People all over the world, and sometimes we got to hit the little button on the email to say translate, because it's certainly not English. So interesting. We never thought things would get so distant with our work out into the world, but it's humbling, that's for sure. So anyways, bud, I'm done rambling. Let's close shop here.
Sounds good.
I'm Sean Allen in Chicago. Thanks for listening, folks.
I have a whirl up in Dillon, Colorado. We will see you in the shoe aisle.